At this point, I'd like to turn it over to our guest speaker, Barbara Davis. She is currently co-director of the Westchester Historical Society. She is also the city historian for New Rochelle, and she's been involved with history for New Rochelle for about 16 years. She has developed many of these programs, one of which you'll be seeing today, and she goes around to different places in the county to other historical societies delivering these programs. So I think you're going to find today's slide presentation very interesting and very entertaining. So at this point, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Barbara Davis.
It is a real pleasure to be here, and I so enjoyed hearing about the activities of the Ardsley Historical Society. Everyone can hear me okay? I have a pretty strong voice. As I said to Peter, my daughter constantly reminds me. And it's fascinating to go around Westchester. Each community has its own personality, as you all know. Each cares for its history in a different way. And some places have both a municipal historian and a historical society. Some have one or the other, and some have none. But each has a different kind of home, different kind of mission, and it's really interesting to see. And I see you're in very good hands, very good hands. And I am delighted to be here today because it's a gorgeous day and we're going on a tour. Now, we're not going on a walking tour this time, but I do plenty of walking tours. In fact, I was just telling Pete that I'm doing a walking tour of Playland in a few weeks for Untapped New York. And they asked for a bio. And in the bio, I put that I do tours. I've done tours by boat, by kayak, bicycle, walking, bus. And this bio went all out, and I think the people that show up are going to think they're getting a very young, athletic person. I hope I don't disappoint them. So today we're going to be touring some of Westchester's sites, and this is a perfect time of year. You know, Westchester is at its best in May with all the blossoming ornamental trees and the flowers, and it just is gorgeous throughout. So it's a very odd-looking map, but it has every topographical feature. It's an old map, and it's to remind us that Westchester's history is long and it's very diverse. And its story can be told in many different ways and has been, including video and YouTube and, in addition, good old print. But one of the most effective ways, and I think one of the most fun ways, is to take a look at its places, its exceptional buildings, its exceptional properties. So today we're going to visit some National Register sites that are accessible to the public. There are quite a few in Westchester, but we've selected some that are the more accessible and also represent different areas and different periods of times. The images in this slideshow are from the Westchester County Historical Society. I'll be telling you a little bit more, but we're just down the road in the County Records Building, and we are primarily a library and research center, though we do have a good online presence with over 90,000 images that you can see from our website. And we are constantly digitizing and getting more images up. But back in 2003, we published this book, Picturing Our Past, which was written by Gray Williams, who also did the photography. He's the Newcastle municipal historian, fabulous individual. And we will eventually have to do an update because there have been more, and I've included in my slideshow some places that were added to the National Register after this book was published. By the way, if you join the Westchester County Historical Society at the $100 level, you get this book. It's a beautiful coffee table book, also makes a great gift, but I'm not going to give any more advertisements till the end. So just to give you a little update, National Register listing landmarking is often confused. These are the designations for historic properties. The creme de la creme National Historic Landmark. There are only 288 of these, or maybe a little more. And in Westchester, in Westchester we have 288. There are about 10 times that many in the state. No protection, just the prestige and saying it's a National Historic Landmark. Playland, by the way, is one of 2 amusement parks that's a National Historic Landmark. Then the next level is listed on the national and state. They're usually hand in hand, or eligible. Also, nominal protection. The only time protection kicks in is when there are going to be alterations in state and federal funds are being used. The most protection are those that are locally designated, when a municipality has a local ordinance and a committee that does the review. Ardsley, not yet, though you do have a stone wall protection, which I think is great. So that's just to give you a little bit of information about the designations. And as far as criteria, they have to exemplify American architecture, period of time, culture, and something distinct. It's also those that are associated with events. I show here the Bronx River Parkway Reservation, the first parkway in the country. We had the first park system in the country. Those that are associated with lives of famous people. And by golly, Westchester is loaded with people of national, international prominence from its earliest times. You're just tripping over them all of the time. And I keep having to remind myself that back in the day, back in the 16, 17, even 1800s, there weren't that many individuals. So we had this lion's share. Also those that represent different periods of time, the Gilded Age, the Industrial Age. And many of our historical sites, or historic house museums, are such homes. And then we have even very modern houses such as this, because if a property embodies a very interesting, very prominent style of architecture, it can also be listed on the National Register. And in the last, are properties that will yield information about the past through archaeology. And the picture I show here from my hometown is David's Island, that for over 100 years served as a major military base. And when the Army Corps of Engineers came in to clean it up with federal monies, a mitigation process kicked in because it was considered eligible for listing because of its archaeological significance. And so there's this whole long process. The buildings were still raised, unfortunately, but there was a mitigation, and as a result, an excellent website was created, and this island and its activities were incredibly well documented, the archives of which are at the New Rochelle Public Library, where I used to work. So, we're going to start with some of the very fabulous places that have met the criteria. Some of our most earliest and well-known are operated by Historic Hudson Valley. This was a nonprofit that was formed by John D. Rockefeller. The Rockefellers, of course, are closely associated with Westchester, and we can be very grateful for the fact that they were keen on historic preservation, because some of our key sites were saved as a result of their interest and their money. These are the properties that are now maintained by Historic Hudson Valley, and we'll see a little bit more about them. But this one, Phillips Manor Hall, which is not part of Historic Hudson Valley, it's one of the very few 17th century buildings remaining in Westchester. It's probably the most important one. This hall was recently reinterpreted. If you haven't been in the last 2 years, I encourage you to go back. They have fabulous, fabulous exhibitions And this, of course, was part of Phillips Manor and the home of the Phillips family. It would later become City Hall or the Town Hall for Yonkers, and then City Hall. In about 1690, the Phillipses built a second house, and we see the Phillips landholding in this map of manors of Westchester. We're going to see it again. They built their second house and a mill at the mouth of the Pecanico River in what we now call Sleepy Hollow. This is known as the Upper Mills. It was acquired by the Rockefellers in the 1940s and restored. So here we have, and by the way, today the Phillipsburg Manor has a wonderful interpretation of their site as well. So Frederick Phillips would marry Margaret de Vries. Frederick Phillips was already very wealthy, but she was also a very wealthy woman, and the two of them, with their great financial holdings, were able to purchase that big stretch of land known as Phillips Manor. Here we have another map that shows just the extent of how much property they had, with the Phillips Manor Hall down at the bottom here, and Phillipsburg Manor in Sleepy Hollow. This was a picture of the Phillips Manor home, which is now the Phillips Manor Hall in Yonkers. And here's an early picture of Phillipsburg Manor at the mouth of the Pecanico River. It has also undergone, during the pandemic, Historic Hudson Valley took that period of time to do restoration. That bridge that we walked across for so many years has been replaced, and there are no more animals there, unfortunately. Many of the historic sites are getting rid of their livestock and instead bringing in gardens. It just is too costly to care for the animals. And both with the Phillips Manor Hall and Phillipsburg Manor, the interpretation now includes history that has been long not told, and that includes the stories of the enslaved individuals who kept up the manor and all of its farming and all of its household care, and really all of the operations of the mill as well. So the Phillipses sided with the British during the Revolution, but the Van Cortlands were loyal to the American cause. And here we have the map of the manors again, and here is all of Cortland Manor. Stephen Van Cortland, or Stephanus Van Cortland, had assembled this vast tract of land in the late 17th century. By the time of the war, though, it had already been broken up among his heirs. Pierre Van Cortland, the grandson of Stephanus, enlarged the manor house on the property he inherited, and it became Cortland Manor. Pierre and his wife Joanna, who you see here, fled during the war in fear of their lives as they were ardent supporters of independence. When they returned, their home was completely destroyed. Their son Philip, who served as an officer in Washington's army, restored it for them. The home lay at the mouth of the Croton River where the mills operated. Sometime before 1746, Philip Van Cortland had installed a rope ferry, literally, but it wasn't pulled, it was on a crank, ferry across the Croton River. And this little ferry house was built to serve as an inn and a tavern for the passengers, and is also part of the historic site. Now, Van Cortland Manor has many programs. They're all on hold while it's undergoing restoration, though the Great Blaze that occurs during Halloween is still very active and a big fundraiser for historic Hudson Valley. Hopefully it will be back again soon. Sunnyside, as you all know, was the home of Washington Irving, the first American to make a living as an author, and often called our first American novelist, competing with James Fenimore Cooper for that title. In 1835, he bought the property in what is now South Tarrytown. It included a small stone cottage that had been one of the many tenant farmhouses on the Phillipsburg Manor. It particularly intrigued him because it had been owned by the Van Tassel family, and he used the Van Tassels as inspiration for his book, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. This illustration shows the house when it was previous to improvement, as he said. He and his friend George Harvey built a new house in and around it. Irving once described it as a little old-fashioned stone mansion with angles and corners as an old cocked hat. He borrowed many examples from his travels for the house, including those from Spain. It has a bit of a Moorish feeling. He had been a diplomat. He had been the ambassador to Spain, and he brought that back. It also recalls the early Dutch houses because of the stepped roof. And he, of course, was the author of Knickerbocker's History of New York. One of the best documented rooms in Americans' historic houses is this one. It's Washington Irving's study, and he had done enough recording of it that Historic Hudson Valley has been able to replicate the study almost to a T, including the sofa on which he would take a nap. The Old Dutch Church, which he made famous in his books, was built in the late 17th century by Frederick Phillips at the Upper Mills. According to local tradition, one of his enslaved servants had a dream that if the long-delayed construction of the church was completed, the nearby dam would then be safe and not washed away by frequent floods. Yes, once the church was constructed, no more flooding. So the legend came true. Whether or not it is a true story, the building was completed in 1702, and when Phillips died, he was buried in a crypt under the floor. The building, with its flared gambrel roof, octagonal bell tower, fieldstone walls, and three-sided apse, has remained largely unchanged for 3 centuries. Although it has no electricity and can only be heated with a wood stove, it's still occasionally used for services. Anybody have the opportunity to go there for a service? It's really quite an experience. It is the earliest surviving church in Westchester, and adjacent to the church is one of the oldest cemeteries, also worth a tour. And of course, it is the site of the annual reenactments of Washington Irving's tale, The Headless Horseman. Don't try to go shopping in Tarrytown the last 2 weeks in October. You know, it's the second most visited community during Halloween after, of course, Salem. Yeah. I bet it's going to reach there. So Rockefeller, as I said, it's one of the family names most associated with Westchester. The patriarch John D. Rockefeller, shown here with his family, began buying land in 1893, beginning with a ridge high above the Hudson River on what had been Phillipsburg Manor. He started with 400 acres, but eventually the estate totaled 3,000 acres. In the beginning, the Rockefeller family, it's a tongue twister, lived in this so-called modest house. And it was only after it burned that he began to build a new one. The first home had been designed by Delano and Aldrich, and the second house, and was modest and unpretentious as well, an eclectic mix of traditional styles. Then there was another plan, but it was not to his satisfaction. So he had his son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., reconstruct it. And John D. Rockefeller Jr. brought in William Bosworth to do the design. He had already started on the gardens for the family, and he was a trained architect, so he then turned to designing the house itself. And this was the end result. The most conspicuous change was the front of the building. The conventional front porch was replaced with what you see here, and the facade itself was richly encrusted with Renaissance Revival style metalwork and sculpture. Kijken means look at in Dutch, and it was John D. Rockefeller Sr.'s favorite home until his death in 1937. It then became the home of John D. Jr. and his wife Abigail. After John's death, it became the chief residence of Abby and John's second son, Nelson, the former governor. And this is where he housed his renowned collection of 20th century painting and sculpture. Has anybody had an opportunity to tour? Yeah, it's pretty spectacular. Its extensive gardens, the coach barn, are owned by the National Trust for Historic Preservation and managed by Historic Hudson Valley. The Orangerie opened up last year as a performing arts center, and they have some excellent programs, and they also have a gallery. Right now, with our W250, or in September, they're going to have some very significant archival materials related to the war that will be on view to the public for free. Take advantage of that and get to see the property, because otherwise it's a big ticket item. And you have to get the bus at Phillipsburg Manor Hall and then travel up. But it is just well worth it, especially right now with the gardens. Union Church is also part of the Rockefeller estate, located in the small settlement of Bacantico Hills, which the Rockefellers built for their people, and they built the church to be non-denominational so all could attend. Designed in 1920 by Ludwig Eisinger, the small Gothic church was purposely planned to be simple, so it didn't have any trappings of any one particular religion. The windows were originally glazed with tinted diamond pennants. However, in the middle of the 20th century, the church received a series of memorial gifts that dramatically changed the interior. When Abigail Rockefeller, wife of John D. Jr., died in 1948, the family decided to donate a stained glass window to the church in her memory, and Nelson suggested that they hire Henry Matisse to do the window. This was completed in 1956. When John Jr. died in 1960, the family commissioned Chagall, creating a swirling, dreamlike vision based on the parable of the Good Samaritan. And that window was installed in 1964. Did anybody see the movie Transatlantic? It's on Netflix, if it's still on. And did you know that John D. Rockefeller funded that organization that helped Jewish artists escape Germany? And Chagall was one of them. So there's a very interesting connection with Chagall to the church. He then prepared designs for the 8 remaining windows. One of these, featuring the crucifixion, was a memorial to Nelson's son Michael, who had been lost at sea during an anthropological expedition in 1961. So Union Church gets all kinds of visitors from all parts of the world, with guides from historic Hudson Valley giving the tours. Now we're going down a little south to Lyndhurst. How many have been to Lyndhurst? Oh, yes, lots of people. As a year after Washington Irving bought Sunnyside, his friend William Paulding, former mayor of New York City, purchased property just north and had his country villa built. He hired Alexander Jackson Davis, the preeminent architect of the picturesque period, who often worked with A.J. Downing to create the landscape and the house as one. This was called the Knoll. In 1804, 1864, the estate was bought by George Merritt, a successful merchant and inventor. Merritt hired Davis to expand that country villa, and he almost doubled it and transformed it into a castle that was just fit for the next owner. In 1880s, Lyndhurst, that name that Merritt gave it, changed hands again when it was purchased by railroad baron J. Gould. It remained with the Gould family until 1964, when they gave a bequest of the property to the National Trust for Historic Places. My co-director, Suzanne Panditch, was the director there for 16 years. The stories she can tell. And she was responsible for much of its restoration. Amazing. And the restoration continues. She had to mothball a number of properties on the property for future restoration. It's widely considered the finest Gothic Revival residence in America. All the features on the property, including the interiors, grounds, and many other buildings, have or will be carefully restored. And here you get a good shot of the interior. They're putting air conditioning in, and she is so upset that they're putting the air conditioning in, because it is going to change the look and the feel, and it's going to be hard on the interior of the building. She'd rather they put the money into restoring the greenhouse. But anyway, that's another thing. Whitby was another of Alexander Jackson Davis's commissions, and it now serves as the Rye Golf Club. And it's part of the Boston Post Road district. So you can have a destination in Rye, have brunch here, go to the Jay Heritage Center, Marshlands, and look at Lounsbury, which we'll see. We have in New Rochelle, we had 8 properties that he designed, but we're down to 2 remaining, and 1 as a ruin after a tragic fire. Okay, now we're going to continue down even further. And I had to include this. It's not in Picturing Our Past, but it's Untermeyer Park, and one of my favorite places in Westchester. You can go any time of the year. You can go on the coldest day of the year if it's over the holidays, and you won't even care about the cold because they have the holiday illumination, and it is just magnificent. Everything about Untermeyer is magnificent, particularly that it's a truly democratic place. So it's situated on a bluff that this estate used to be on. It was called Greystone. You can get a feel for Greystone by just going down a little further to the Hudson River Museum and going into Glenview Manor, and you get the feel for what Greystone was like. First owned by John Waring and then by Samuel Tilden, who had an unsuccessful run for president, but he was a governor of New York. And then Samuel Untermeyer, who was a public reformer. So Tilden, when he was there, started the gardens, but then Samuel Untermeyer went crazy with them. And who did he hire to design them but Bosworth? And if you want to know more about Bosworth, Stephen Burns, who is responsible for transforming and saving and transforming Untermeyer, did a really good program, and it's on tape on the Untermeyer website. So in a nutshell, Samuel Untermeyer, fascinating man, but he was a wealthy attorney. He was Jewish. I keep looking at because there's a lot of police activity going on out there. He was a wealthy Jewish, a Democratic Party activist, a suffrage proponent, and founder of the non-sectarian anti-Nazi League. He was very good friends with Thomas Edison. No, with, not Thomas Edison, excuse me. It will come to me. In 1915, he commissioned William Wells Bosworth to develop this 150-acre estate. And by the 20s, it was known almost around the world. He used to have busloads of people come in. He would open it to the public. He would bring in cops from New York. He would bring in children from orphanages. His wife, who was Catholic, would put on these great shows in the amphitheater. Duncan sisters, Isadora Duncan and her sister, would perform. She had poetry readings. It was quite the place. He employed 60 full-time gardeners. There were 60 greenhouses. And they would supply not only the 29-room Grayston Mansion, but also other places. And when he designed it, Bosworth created a walled garden because Untermeyer wanted this to be inspired by the Persian gardens started in Persia, now Iran, during Zoroastrian times. And interestingly, Zoroastrian religion is all based on doing good deeds. And that was certainly what Samuel Untermeyer was about. So there was classical architecture also. The whole walled garden is in quadrants, and they represent the four rivers They represent the four rivers. They represent north, east, south, west. The four elements. And then he also employed Italian and classical, as you can see in the Doric columns and the Ionic columns. And here's the amphitheater that would hold the performances. This is a walkway down to the river, patterned after Ville d'Este in Italy, including the trees that go down the allée that takes your eye right down to the bottom to the overlook, which has the pillars at the bottom that came from Stanford White's house. Sort of weird thing. But it was, so there was the Greek influence, the Italian influence, but all in this Persian garden. And today, it really, when I said it's the most democratic place, it is. And it certainly has the foundation for being such. So when Samuel Untermeyer died in 1940. The garden went into limbo until about 1946. By the way, after he died, his estate tried to gift it to the federal government. No. The state? No. Westchester County? No. But they were all pretty smart because you need a big endowment to take care of this property. City of Yonkers took it and eventually had to sell bit by bit off. And depending on the administration, it fell into hard times. Some of us remember the son of Sam would hang out there and do his satanic rituals. Then it became a hippie hangout, graffiti. During that period of time, John Lennon was a visitor. And here's the Temple of Love today. And here's John Lennon standing. I just think that's a cool thing. And the Temple of Love is just phenomenal now. The rock gardens. I have a whole program called Historic Gardens of Westchester, and I spend a lot of time on Untermeyer because there's so much to talk about. But we have to continue on our tour. Before we do, if you do have a chance to take a tour, you can. If you join the Untermeyer website, you get their e-blasts. They're not overwhelming at all. And if you get a chance to tour with Stephen Burns, this guy works with the city of Yonkers, who still maintains the property in part while they maintain the garden and the horticulture. And the city of Yonkers does the rentals, the weddings, and all of that, and the film shoots. Amazing. He himself is an architect and has created this just phenomenal place. So take a tour with him if you can. They have great docents. Here's the beginning of the walled garden and one of the several books that have been written about Untermeyer. All right. Now, we're certainly not going in chronological order because now we're going to John Jay's period. We've left the Gilded and we're going backwards. One of America's greatest leaders was a Westchester native. And we're fortunate to have two sites in Westchester that still remind us of his contributions and relate periods of time. He was a lawyer by profession, but his real career was public service. His energy, intelligence, fair-minded judgment, and personal integrity were widely respected. He served as a member of the Continental Congress, U.S. Secretary of Foreign Affairs, and of course was the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He finished his career in 1801 as governor of New York and retired to a home he had built earlier in Katona. This is land he had inherited from his father, who had purchased 750 acres, and then they included more. Unfortunately, his wife died the next year, and he never remarried. He was a widower with 5 children, and he lived in this house until his death. He became a gentleman farmer. He really enjoyed gardening, and the farm actually was also a dairy farm, and they would ship the milk to Manhattan. Of course, Westchester was filled with dairy farms at one point. He was keenly interested in agriculture, horticulture, his family, his church, and abolition. Even though he himself was an enslaver, he spent much of his life fighting for abolition. The John Jay Homestead is now a New York State Historic Site. You can't visit the inside right now. I know, darn it. You would think that they could have gotten this all done during COVID. Well, they're redoing the whole thing, reinterpreting. And I have to say, a lot of our historic places needed reinterpretation. One of the reasons is, very quickly, this is such a good time to be involved with history because we're learning so much more thanks to digitization and thanks to the internet. And so more information is rising to the surface. I've been the city historian for New Rochelle, serving as such since 2001. And it wasn't until 2 years ago that I discovered that New Rochelle had one of the most active underground railroad operations. Unbelievable. Nobody knew this before. And it was only because diaries came out, and we had the diary of Lydia Maria Childs, who stayed at the home of Joseph Carpenter. That's another story. But anyway, they're reinterpreting, but you can still visit the grounds. And if you go on a Saturday, you can also go to their wonderful farmers market. 9:30 opens. Anyway, so this is the house where the Jay family lived. And the gardens, they have a historic herb garden, a classical garden, a lot of the outbuildings. It is hopefully going to be reopened in time for RW 250. And that's one of the reasons why these properties are undergoing the restoration. Here's a picture of the gardens. It's also on my garden talk. Now, this house was a house in Rye. And this was the home that the Jay family lived in when John Jay was born. It was called the Locust. And it was a rambling farmhouse, as you can see, begun in 1745 by Jay's father, Peter Jay. In 1836, Jay's son, also named Peter, wrote to his brother, "It is with great reluctance that I shall pull down the old house. Had it been possible to repair and make it comfortable, I would have done so." Some people think this served as inspiration as the locust in James Fenimore Cooper's book, The Spy. Worth a reread. It's a slog, but it's worth a reread, particularly getting ready for the Revolutionary War observances. This is the house that he built in its stead. Neoclassical design. This is actually the back of the house. And this house had a tremendous, and still does, view of a meadow and then Long Island Sound. Today, whenever you go, you can sit on the porch in a rocking chair and take in the view that the Jay family took in. The Jay Heritage Center has done a monumental job. This was a long 20-year fight to save the property. And it was taken over by a group of volunteers that has grown into the Jay Heritage Center, which has done just extraordinary and continues to do extraordinary work. Here's the front of the house. It's an ongoing work in progress. What's so wonderful is you can actually see step by step how the restoration is taking place and why, the reasons. Bruce McDonald is the lead restorer. There's also a carriage house, a zebra house. Yes, one of the owners had a zebra, and really, really phenomenal gardens that represent hundreds of years Here's the house in a more restored form. Now, when I said you could make a trip out of this, I'm always looking out for your best interest. This is the Boston Post Road District, and it starts with Whitby over here, which is the Alexander Jackson Davis house, and then there's Lounsbury, which is a privately owned house, then Marshlands Conservancy, and then here's the Peter J. house and the meadow down to the water. And there are trails that you can go through either by the meadow or here from Marshlands right down to the water. If you're lucky, like I was a couple weeks ago, I found the tail end of the Audubon birders, and I just tagged along and got all the information. It's really quite something. Now, I saw all of you shake your heads. Yes, you already knew that the Bronx River Parkway was the first parkway in the country. But not everybody knows that it was designed intentionally to be a park, a reservation. It was designed to clean up terrible sewage. The Bronx River had become an empty sewer, and it was contaminating the Zoological Society, the Bronx Zoo. So after many years, the sewer commission originally conceived of the Bronx River Parkway back in the late 1800s. But it took several decades for the funding to come through. But when it came through, it was designed in such a phenomenal way. So it was meant to clean up the sewage, to stop flooding. I know, but we've been very built up since then. It was completed in 1925, and it was originally designed for pleasure driving. And the whole park system, the Westchester County Park System, was a series of parks connected by these pleasure driving parkways. Undulating roads, curves, a view of the river as much as possible. You still see that today. I must say, I'm on the county's Historic Preservation Advisory Committee, have been since 1990, and it's a constant struggle. But you have to say hats off to how they have protected so many of the historically significant sites. You know, the new stretch that they just opened up between Scarsdale and Hartsdale, you really get a feel for the parkway. So, and you can also go, if you're not, you can take a leisurely drive. People honking behind you. You're supposed to only go 40 miles an hour. Or you can, of course, take advantage of Bicycle Sunday and really get a feel for Gilmore Clark and Jay Downer's extraordinary work in designing the rustic bridges. In fact, what they did was put a call out to their friends. Oh, I'm really getting off track. But this is such an interesting story. When they were building the Bronx River Parkway reservation, they said to their friends, wherever you travel, send us postcards of bridges. And I found, when I worked for the Parks Department, a box that said Bridge Box. And inside it were all these postcards from Germany, Austria, all over. And I'm rifling through and I go, there's the Glen Island Bridge. The Park Commission took inspiration from these bridges from all over the country and the world. Okay, so on the National Register. And of course, so many parks. The park system, the Westchester County Park Commission that formed America's first park system, including the Honchitson River Parkway, Sprain came later, Sawmill River Parkway, which you all know so well. 16,000 acres of land is what they amassed during the 20s. It was phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. And we can thank them today because we have all this open space. It's all conservation. I don't have to tell you. And then in 1926, they started on Playland. It was built in 1 year. And it was considered to be the most extraordinary amusement park. There had been amusement parks there before, but they cleaned it all up. And Walker and Gillette, who also designed the county center in Art Deco, designed Playland in Art Deco style, with a central courtyard with a stretch all the way down to the music tower. This was the new age of skyscrapers, and this was meant to be their tribute to the era of skyscrapers. And then the colonnades on either side would hide the colors and the rides, and the honky-tonk stuff would be to the side. So everybody could enjoy this peace and quiet, and the colors, the palette was a very soft sage and orange to, I could go on and on. And of course, their rides. This is one of the original rides. You can take a ride on history, I say. The carousel was original, the Derby Racer was original, and the Whip was original. The other ones that are individually on the National Register are the Dragon Coaster, Kittyland, and the Old Mill. And of course, they designed the bathhouse and the pool with water, fresh water, so clean you could take a drink of it. And then it led out to the beach that was always so crowded with people. It's more than an amusement park. Here's an earlier picture of the colonnade you see. Thank goodness the restoration over the past few years included taking off the orange fins that the Marriott group put up, and it now is more representative of the original design. All right, total switch. St. Paul's Church. It's actually St. Paul's St. Paul's Church Historic Site. It is a National Historic Landmark, and it's a national park. It was an extremely important site in discussing the Revolutionary War period. Not only is the church fascinating, but the graveyard, which contains the graves of many of those who fought in the Revolution. It also includes graves of enslaved servants who lived nearby. Just really amazing. It began as a church for about 20 families from Connecticut who founded the village of Eastchester, which, you know, of course, included also Bronxville, Tuckahoe, even part of the Bronx, Mount Vernon. And the original church was a small square building roofed and sided with wooden shingles. But when the congregation grew, construction for a new, grander church took place in 1765. It wasn't completed, though, until after the war. And after the war, because during the war, the church was used as a military hospital, and the old church was demolished for firewood. St. Paul's remained a key community institution in what became known as the village of Mount Vernon during the 1800s, but the area became increasingly more urban and industrial, and it became a city in 1892. By the 30s, it was going to be demolished. Its rector at the time, William Henry Weigel, with the support of Sarah Delano Roosevelt, mother of FDR, were largely responsible for saving St. Paul's, drawing public attention to its historical significance. However, the congregation kept dwindling, and in 1980, St. Paul's, along with its cemetery, was taken over by the National Park Service. It's operated as a museum and research center of early American life. David Osborne, who's the site manager, does a really, really top-notch job with his programs. The seating is weird. How many have been in St. Paul's? You know how when you go there for a concert, you have to sit in those boxes that kept you warm in the winter, but you have to sort of look over there. But it's such a great historic site. They just honored Susan Seal, who was responsible for the restoration of the Odell House. And here's the church today. The Miller House, the last remaining 18th century, one of the last remaining 18th century buildings in White Plains, was the home of Anne Fisher Miller. Her husband was in the militia and died. Mrs. Miller was there when the Battle of White Plains occurred. She was the one who, with her children, kept the farm going, and all the troops who were embedded on the property and up on the hill during that famous 1776 battle. The earliest part of the house dates back to 1738. The original portion of was built in 1738 and then added on to around 1770. It's gone on to additional restoration as of late. It is still an excellent example of colonial vernacular architecture. Okay, here's another picture of it. After he died, as I said, Ann Fisher Miller and her 5 children held down the property during that faithful battle. And by 1850, it became the unofficial shrine to George Washington. You see it all over. My predecessor, New Rochelle historian Tom Hochter, used to say, don't tell them the myth, because that's what they'll remember. It wasn't the headquarters of George Washington, probably. It's still up to debate. The Purdy House is the other one in contention. They both claim to be the headquarters. We do know he came through, and of course the Battle of White Plains happened here, so it's a very, very important site that is operated by Westchester County Parks Department with assistance from the Daughters of the American Revolution. And here's one of the enactments on George Washington's birthday. The Jacob Purdy House, built before 1721, is the place where many people think that Washington had his headquarters. It was during the 20th century, the Purdy House had become a slum tenement and was almost torn down. But in 1973, citizens of White Plains rallied to protect it. It's now owned by the City of White Plains and maintained by the White Plains Historical Society. They also have a reenactment on Washington's birthday. So now we're going to go very quickly through some other historic house museums that also serve as the headquarters for historical societies and are maintained by historical societies. I will say that over the past decade or so, many historical societies have found they cannot keep up with it. There's lack of volunteers, there's lack of money, and there's lack of school bus funds. And if you can't bring schools to the house, you can't keep the house going. So, for example, Scarsdale, they sold their historic house property, but put it into a trust, a preservation easement, so that the owners can't unpreserve it. There's no such word. They can't do anything that's not authentic to the property, and they took that money to then put into working on their archives and making a series of videos, which they've been doing very successfully to attract younger members, and it's working. So, and they've had some funds to do some very good programs. But anyway, these are ones that are still going. The Square House in Rye, and the Square House was Widow Haviland's Tavern. Many times back in colonial periods, when a woman lost her husband, what could she do? She could run a tavern. So many widows ended up opening up their houses to give people food and a place to stay along the post roads, whether it was 22 or the Boston Post Road. The Square House is on the Boston Post Road, and yes, Washington did sleep here. After dinner, through frequent light showers, we proceeded to the tavern of Mrs. Haviland at Rye, wrote the very prolific diarist George Washington, who keeps a very neat and decent inn. The J.P. Brissett de Warville, in his book New Travels in the United States, gave the inn this rave review: "We stopped at one of the best taverns I've seen in America, and it is kept by Mrs. Haviland." Also, General Lafayette stopped here. And we're going to be observing his 200th anniversary of his grand tour that he came back to do in 1874. And we have all these people coming through, and they will be stopping in New Rochelle, where Lafayette stopped because of the French connection, founded by French Huguenots, and at the Square Tavern, August 18th, for those who are interested. Then, here's an earlier picture of Haviland's Tavern. The Historical Society also owns this house, which is considered the oldest surviving house in Westchester, built probably mid-1600s. You see the term salt box comes from the resemblance of a slant-topped box with the hinge that was used for salt, and this is a perfect example of a salt box design. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of his country, but he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered, yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. These were words that were penned by Thomas Paine, instigating the colonists to take up the war for independence. And in tribute to Tom Paine, he was gifted 300 acres of land in New Rochelle. It had been farmed by the DeVoe family, who sided with the British. The land was confiscated from them. It started on North Avenue and stretched all the way to Mamaroneck. The house was later moved down from its spot where this picture was taken when before Thomas Paine was gifted it, and it's now at the bottom of the hill as the Thomas Paine Cottage, operated by the Huguenot and New Rochelle Historical Association. He lived there for the very last few years of his life. He was greatly maligned. When he tried to vote, he was refused. They said he was a citizen of France, not the United States. Because he was an atheist. As you know, Teddy Roosevelt called him that filthy little atheist. So he was much aligned over the years, and I think is now, just when people are reading his words and seeing their incredible relevance even today, that I think Thomas Paine has achieved, or will be achieving, the stance that was given to him when they erected this monument in his honor, which has been recently restored. It was first just the column, which has words from him inscribed on the column, and then the bust came later. Now, which house is this? This is Smith's Tavern in Armonk. And this is operated by the North Castle Historical Society. And their property also includes the Brundage Blacksmith Shop, the East Middle Patton one-room schoolhouse, 1798 Quaker Meeting House, a privy, and this building, the historic Smith's Tavern. Again, it was dates back to the Revolutionary War, when it was used as headquarters for the local militia fighting the British. And in 1797, militia captain John Smith became the owner of the tavern, and it became the center for community life. This is where people voted. This is where people paid their taxes when taxation occurred. And then his son took it over and continued operating it till 1884. The North Castle Historical Society does a really fine job with the whole property. You know, what we're going to learn during the RW 250 is that there was probably, and I think I can safely say, there was no other place in the colonies that suffered as long and as hard as the people of Westchester. It was 7 long years, and we're going to be learning more and more about that. At the Historical Society, we're in the process with a federal grant of transcribing the MacDonald Papers, which are 407 first-hand accounts of people who experienced the war years, oral histories that were handwritten. These include women. They include people who were young children during the war recalling, and we're seeing over and over and over again this strife. We're also seeing how it was a civil war. It was neighbor against neighbor, loyalist against patriot, sometimes brother against brother. Then with the Skinners and the Cowboys, the whaleboatmen, that there was just lawlessness for so many years. But all right, we've just talked about some Revolutionary War sites. Now we're moving to Somers, where Hakaliah Bailey, who was a farmer and a driver in Somers, he periodically drove herds of cattle down to the Croton Turnpike to Sing Sing, now Ossining, to be shipped out to sail to New York City. And somewhere around 1807, he came back from the city after delivering his cattle with a 7-year-old Indian elephant, an elephant from India, who became known as Old Bet. Bailey then formed a traveling menagerie with Old Bet as the star attraction, and it was so successful that many others started. And it's quite incredible how many connections Little Somers has to the circus. I attended the rededication of their Old Bet, number 5, in front of their town hall, which is right there where Hakalia Bailey, that was named Elephant Hotel after Old Bet, and you see the original monument to Old Bet, and then it was elephant was later added. It's just been restored. The Elephant Hotel now serves as the town hall and the Somers Historical Society. Oh, what I was going to say, the president of the National Circus Association attended the event. And everybody was dressed up with some funny things. And then when they played the Star Spangled Banner, it was a guy on a harmonica. What circus spirit they have up in Somers. Okay, now in Hastings, not so frivolous, Dr. John William Draper, a professor of chemistry and physiology at what is now NYU, purchased 20 acres in Hastings, and he made major contributions to chemistry and physics. He helped found the medical college and NYU itself, was the author of the standard text on physiology, wrote books on history, philosophy. Here's a guy you don't want to sit next to at a dinner party. Woo! Including a 3-volume history of the Civil War. His interest in the chemical reactions produced by light led him to the infant medium of photography, and he made several technical improvements in the processes. He took the first photographs of the moon, and that was through a telescope on the roof of NYU. His favorite child, as he said, his second son Henry, shared his father's passion for science and photography, and like his father, became a professor at NYU. And in 1858, after visiting an observatory in Ireland, he decided to build his own in Hastings. So over the next few years, he and his brother Daniel constructed a telescope, set it up in a framed building with a rotating dome that was located on this estate. And as soon as the telescope was completed, he began taking photographs of the sun, stars, and moon. And within a year, he had made over 1,500 negatives. His youngest daughter, whom you rarely hear about, Antonia Draper Dixon, was also an American astronomer and was the first person to detect and calculate the orbit of a spectroscopic binary. She eventually inherited the observatory and called it Observatory Cottage. And today it's the Archive and Museum of the Hastings Historical Society. A new archive and library wing were added in the 1990s. Stephen Tilley, a very excellent historic preservation architect. Okay, our last one, Horace Greeley, another family to whom Westchester can point to with pride is the Greeley family. Of course, he was one of the greatest newspaper men in all times, a founder of the Liberal Republican Party, a reformer, and a politician. In 1841, he merged several newspapers, and it became the New York Tribune, a paper which he edited for the rest of his life. In 1931, the Dictionary of American Biography described the Tribune. It set a new standard for American journalism by its combination of energy in news gathering with good taste, high moral standards, and intellectual appeal. He was a member of Congress from 1848 to 49, but failed at his other attempts to win office and his attempt to try to unseat President Grant in 1872. But he probably, instead of being a newspaper man, really wanted to be a farmer. And he even said that's what he should be. All my riper tastes inclined to that blessed calling, he said. So in 1852, he bought a farm in Chappaqua, Newcastle, and within the limits of his career as an editor, he attempted to farm it. And it occupied much of what is now downtown Chappaqua. He then purchased a home that was near the property, and that home is now the Newcastle Historical Society. They restored it in the mid-1900s. It's a really interesting interior. Great municipal historian, Gray Williams, who wrote that and took the pictures of picturing our past. This is our last. I'm going to crown this, no pun intended, the most eclectic house in our program. And this is the Armour-Steimer Octagonal House, which was built by New York financier and devotee of phrenology, Paul J. Armour. And this was in about 1860. Fairly simple, contained only a basement and 2 stories. When prominent New York City tea merchant Joseph Steiner purchased it in 1872, and he added the 2-story dome and a soaring cupola. There would be other occupants. The best known was Carl Carmer. He began living in the house from about 1940. He was an author, poet, and historian. His death occurred in 1976. His legacy includes tales of a residential ghost. The house was actually included in some of his work, and shortly after he died, it was acquired by the National Trust for Historic Preservation because it was threatened with demolition. This is from, don't try to go on this tour, this was last year, but I couldn't find a good picture for this one. They still have tours on a regular basis, including a ghost tour. It gets all dressed up during the holidays. There is admission, but it's worth it. It's a lot of fun. The house is fascinating. And it was actually the first house to be acquired by the National Trust, and it was resold to Joseph Pell Lombardi. He's done just a superb job at keeping it up, and part of the way he does that is to have the tours, and we all get to see the inside of it. So that concludes my program, but if you want to learn more, Clio, which is an app, but you can also see it, you can see it on your phone, you can see it on your computer, you have to do theclio.com. Pete was nice enough to send us some entries for Ardsley. We have tried to include, we've put all the National Register sites of Westchester on this app that you can look at. There's pictures, there's sometimes video, short, sweet. Wherever you go in Westchester, you can look up and see these sites. We are celebrating our 150th anniversary this year. Among our founders was the grandson of Alexander Hamilton and the grandson of John Jay. Those were just among the few men, of course. Women were finally let in 1901, and then they took over. Made it really good. So with our 150th, we are having a family history hunt this summer. Ardsley sent in their entries. It will be a fun thing you can do with your app. There'll be prizes. It's going to get people out, seeing the places. Each community has about 3. It's like herding cats, trying to get all these historians to send in their text and their recordings, but I'm almost there. And we will have a big event in October with Teddy Roosevelt's great-grandson, Kermit Roosevelt IV, speaking, and he is an expert on the Reconstruction that didn't happen and this period of time and its relationship to the Constitution. It will be a very interesting, engaging talk on the first Sunday in October 6th. And you can visit us anytime online. You can look for pictures of Ardsley. Just there's a keyword search. Our reading room is open on Wednesdays for researchers. We've seen a number of Ardsley students come in, and we're always available to answer questions. If you want to know more about free events that are history related in Westchester, other walking tours, other programs, we have a monthly e-blast that puts out that kind of information. You can just email me, Barbara at westchesterhistory.com with your email. We have some brochures here, and we'd love to see you. So thank you very much.
Does anybody have any questions for Barbara?
She talked too much.
Go ahead, Frank.
The properties that have historical significance that are not protected, are they privately owned mainly?
It's a variety. You can't list something on the National Register unless you agree to it, except for historic districts. So, like the historical societies, sometimes the community owns the historic buildings, sometimes the organization owns it, sometimes they're privately owned. For example, in New Rochelle, we have 13 historic sites that are on the National Register. They include the train station, they include the castle that was formerly College of New Rochelle, they include a private house from the 1600s, they include a former library. So it's a mix, some privately owned, some publicly owned. Publicly owned sometimes is the worst, particularly with the city, because it's low on the totem pole. You know, it's really hard for a municipality to rationalize expenditures for historic property. Not everybody sees historic properties as being top of the list. But of course I do. What's that?
Are they taken off the
No,
tax roll?
no. Only if they're owned by the municipality. You know, if they're nonprofit, they wouldn't be on the tax roll anyway.
Barbara, at the top of Old Army Road and Ashford Avenue, there's this old, large house, looks like a farm, and it's dilapidated. And what I understand is when the parkway was first opened, the cars used to come up from New York City, go up that road, go have lunch there, enjoy the afternoon, and then go back down the parkway. Do you know anything
I
about that?
don't know about it, but I'm intrigued now.
I don't, that's all I know.
I'll have to look that up. Ashford and
No, it's Old Army Road and and
Ardsley Road.
Ardsley Road. Actually, before you go down the hill into Scarsdale. And it's.
I'll go
on
home
the
that
east
way. I'll go
side.
home that way and check it out.
Barbara, you mentioned Rock Hills came to Westchester and started buying property in 1893. Do you know what was it here? What was the catalyst for coming here in 1893?
I don't know, to be perfectly honest, but I can find out and email you. I'm sure Suzanne knows. I know that he loved the topography and the site because it was overlooking the Hudson, but I don't know if he knew somebody, and that's how we ended up here. I don't know.
Just a quick,
Also, it was, you know, he could get into, well, the train hadn't come through yet, but it was being expected.
I think his brother already had property with Phelps. His brother William already had property there.
So maybe that was it. That seems likely. Yep.
And William was buried in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. So the other thing is that you mentioned the Miller House. Since I was looking at it, it's kind of a bit of a nondescript kind of a house. It's a very simple farmhouse. I know there's a lot of controversy about it. It had fallen into great disrepair with the county executive before the current one wanted to just let it go and was not interested in preserve it.
No, the previous one.
The previous one. So
Yeah.
the current one put a lot of money into it. But what was the really that issue preserving the Miller House? Is it really worth putting $3 million in the house when it's telling me that kids don't go there anymore?
I know. Well, HPAC, right. I'll tell you what HPAC thought. HPAC is Historic Preservation Advisory Committee, which are a group of experts, top-notch experts. I'm on it just because I can organize them and do all the logistical stuff. And I have the passion. But we actually recommended that it be moved because it's opposite a cement factory. And so it's always under the environmental impact of what is generated by a concrete company and the noise, and there's no place to park a school bus. So they can't do a whole lot of programming, and the county parks department is not really, that's not sort of their thing. It was parks, recreation, and conservation, but not really preservation. They're not historic house operators. And we had thought it was a tenant farmhouse, so why not move it to Phillipsburg Manor, was something we suggested. Then somebody thought Kensico Plaza, no, it doesn't belong there. Then up the hill where the battle took place, so that fell apart. And the North White Plains folks really wanted it to stay on Virginia Road. The county can't let this very important Revolutionary War property be demolished, So when they first went out to do the restoration, it was $1 million. And by the time it finally got through, that had tripled. And they are running programs there now in conjunction with, I can't remember the acronym, but they're called the Dolls, because it's Daughters of Liberty and something. And they're running some programs. They put in a classroom. They made the parking lot so you can at least get a bus to turn around. So hopefully it will become more widely used to make that investment worthwhile. Yeah, it's a difficult field, historic preservation, because certainly parks people don't have the training to do historic preservation. Often historic preservation saves money, but not everybody realizes it. They just think it's a bigger expenditure, because historic preservationists will say, do not remove the windows, because the replacement windows you put in are probably only going to last 25 to 30 years. The windows you're taking out have been there for 3 centuries for a reason. And it's not often energy efficient. And mostly the older houses are, the most sustainable house is an older house, because they built it in such a way with materials that are much more, have greater strength and have lasted all this time for good reason. So it's always a difficult thing. We've been, it's given me a lot of playland, the fights, because, faster is better, and synthetic over natural in some people's minds. So it's a tough thing, but we try our best. And you have to compromise. You have to pick your battles.
I grew up in Purchase, and there are estates there. Governor Lehman lived in Purchase, the Strauss family. There was a book called Our Crowd, which talks about all of these families. And I just wonder if...
None that I can think of are on the National Register. Boss Ward's is, but he's Portchester Purchase line. William Ward, it's the concrete house. Reed Castle is on the National Register. But I didn't include the ones that don't have a lot of accessibility. And I mean, Reed Hall has some because it's on a college campus. But they're close to 400 sites, so I had to pick and choose the ones.
Yeah, no, it's not that. I just wondered, I wonder if there are pictures that are taken of these houses to at least have a record of them. That could be done by the Historical Society, because I'm sure you could write a book of Lost Westchester.
Oh yeah, in fact there was a book by Michael Rebick, Lost Yonkers. It wasn't Lost in Yonkers, it was Lost Yonkers. I mean, we've lost so many places. We're very fortunate to have so many, but yeah, and there's some brutal ones. I have a program on historic preservation. I start with those that we've lost with Joni Mitchell in the background. You don't know what you've got till it's gone. And that's why the Clio is so helpful for people to see these places and go, well, wait, and the local ordinances. We really try to help communities enact local ordinances so they can be sure that there's at least a demolition clause so that these buildings aren't torn down before anybody knows it. We usually get the phone call in the 11th hour when you can't do anything. now's the time, and that's why a lot of communities do what's called a reconnaissance level survey. Is the number one thing, and that is sort of a windshield view. You go drive all around and take pictures of all the buildings, all the properties, because sometimes, like in Ardsley, it could be stone wall. All the properties and features that need to be protected. And you get community people involved to come up with a plan, a preservation plan. Those are the first steps for Ardsley. Purchase, I don't think they have one.
As part of this purchase, Harrison and Purchase are bought.
Yeah, and I don't think they do. It's a tough sell for many communities, and a lot of people, it seems undemocratic for other people to tell you what you can and cannot do to your house. And that's what a local ordinance does. On the other hand, it's been shown over and over and over that it increases property values. And they're not that onerous. The restrictions or protective measures, I should say, aren't that onerous. It usually involves any drastic changes in material or craftsmanship or features to the facade. You can do whatever you want on the inside. Meanwhile, all of these houses, if state and federal funds aren't being used, any of these properties could be painted purple or pink or torn down because the National Register does not give any blanket protection.
What is the stone wall that you're talking about?
When I was investigating local ordinances, I came up that Ardsley has some kind of stone wall thing. You don't know about it? I could be wrong.
Stone pillars.
Is it stone pillars?
The homeland development in the 30s. Beacon Hill Road to the 2 by the old water wheel. What's that one? Revolutionary. There's
By the
two
way,
there.
also stone wall.
Google Ardsley
There were six.
stone walls to see what you come up with. I'm not that familiar. I just know I was doing sort of trying to make a chart, a spreadsheet of what communities did have local ordinances and who didn't and how they intend. Bedford has the most protective of all the ordinances, and that was thanks to John Stockbridge, who will be honoring with the Cy Shulman Award at our annual meeting, which is June 8th. And we're holding it in the place that the first Westchester County Historical Society annual meeting was held in 150 years ago. And that was the Presbyterian Church of White Plains. And we're going to be showing the history of the society. And we give out annually this award. And the 2 recipients this year will be John Stockbridge, the municipal historian for Bedford, and the Bronx River Parkway Conservancy for their work in protecting that iconic, defining element of Westchester. If you think about it, what defines us most? The parkways in the park system, really, is one of the biggest things. And the lion's share of important people that have made their home here. We just trip over them all the time. Oh yeah, my family gets so tired of it. Oh, and they're from New Rochelle. Oh, and did you know they're from New Rochelle? Oh, we quit with that. But a lot of famous people from New Rochelle too. That's another program.
Barbara,
Okay.
thank you very much. That concludes our annual meeting. Thank you all for coming. Please help yourself to refreshments.